In this video, I'll be describing the production of these 4 patterns of rosettes for guitars. In our previous videos on making guitar rosettes, we produced boards with 15 thin layers of veneer woods, which were used to create 48 segment rosettes. In this video, I'll be producing rosettes with the different patterns. I'll be producing these 4 guitar rosettes with 7 layers of woods in each of the 48 segments. In the center of the wedges, I'm using a 3/8 inch thick wide board with a figured grain patterns. In 2 of the rosettes, I'll be using Tulip Wood, and the other 2 I'll be using Zebra Wood. In the previous videos, I used a single layer spacer between each of the wedges. In this video, I'll be using a 3-layer spacer between each of the wedges. Each of the thin veneers in these spacers is only 12 thousandths to 15 thousandths of an inch thick. I'm covering a lot of details in this video. In order to keep this video shorter, I'll be skipping over showing the same operation on each of the rosette patterns. Each of the other rosettes produced in the same manner, and there was no need to repeat the same step in this video for each of the rosettes. I'll begin the process by slicing the 3/8 inch thick Tulip Wood and Zebra Wood boards for the center pattern. This board is a piece of Tulip Wood. Again, it was given to me by Dan Mitchell from California. And I'm using this as the center section for some of these rosettes I'm making for guitars. And I want some thicker pieces. I want to be able to show the grain. So I'll probably make some probably 1/4 inch, maybe even 3/8 inch wide pieces. I have this mounted on my Accu-Sled 2 carriage using the flat plate mounts. So this first cut to give me a flat surface, so the next boards will be perfectly parallel to that surface. I first of all cut off a thin sliver of wood to give me a flat surface, so all subsequent cuts will be parallel to the surface. I then cut a number of boards 250 thousandths of an inch thick and then 350 thousandths of an inch thick. I also cut the Zebra Wood board in the same manner, which is not shown in this video. For that 1.5 inch square by 20 inch long piece of Tulip Wood, I was able to cut on my first board 250 thousandths or 1/4 inch thick, and I cut 3 boards 350 thousandths of an inch thick, which is probably ones I'm going to use for this project. And these are going to be the center sections. I'll outline these with some other woods just to make it stand out. I cut a number of thin boards between 25 thousandths and 75 thousandths inch thick using the Accu-Slice system on the bandsaw. And again, this was shown in videos 1 and 2, and I'm not going to repeat the description in detail here. I cut a number of thin boards for this project, including ebony, maple, and padauk. And again, these boards will be used for the outlining strips to make the laminate boards. From an 1.5 inch thick board of ebony, I was able to cut 4 boards 75 thousandths of an inch thick. I cut 4 pieces 50 thousandths of an inch thick, and I cut 5 pieces 25 thousandths of an inch thick. And so I use these as accent pieces for the rosettes I'll be making shortly. In a likewise manner, I'll be cutting some other boards for the other strips to use in these rosettes. To make this next set of rosettes, I'm doing something a little different. Instead of using a bunch of thin laminates, I'm actually using a wide board in the center. In these 2, I have a piece of Tulip Wood, which is about 3/8 of an inch thick, and then I've outlined it with some ebony and some maple strips just to give it some detail. On these 2, I cut some strips off a piece of Zebra Wood. Again, it has some nice grain to it, and again, outline it, in this case with maple and ebony. In this case, I'm using yellow heart and padauk as the outlining pieces. So once again, to glue these laminate boards together, I'll be using my glue jig system. This consists of 2 angle irons on a sliding rail, and I put wax paper on it to keep the glue off the jigs. And these only have 7 layers, so I don't need to use epoxy. The only reason I use epoxy is when I'm gluing boards that have maybe 10 to 20 layers, where the setup time might be, half an hour. But to only glue up 7 boards, I can set these up, in 3 or 4 minutes, which is plenty of time. So glue all set. So once again, just putting glue on one surface of the boards. I'm using a foam paintbrush to apply the Type Bond 3 glue to the surfaces of the boards. And I normally apply the Type Bond 3 glue to both sides of the boards. I want to make sure I get good coverage of the boards. And then when I clamp it in the glue jig system, the clamping system will squeeze out the excess glue. Here I'm gluing on the final piece of ebony, attaching it to my set of boards, making sure they're nice flat, and then insert them into the glue jig system inside the wax paper cradle, and then applying a series of spring clamps to clamp the boards and squeeze out the excess glue. I normally apply the clamp, you set high, low on the L bracket, just to make sure you get good clamping action. Okay, let that dry for about an hour. That's the one advantage using the Type Bond 3 glue. That I can set up in about an hour, where the epoxy takes 4 or 5 hours to set up. So it's much faster using the Type Bond glue. In the same manner, I glued up the other 3 sets of laminate boards to make these 4 rosette patterns. I'm ready to clean up the edges of these 4 boards. There's not near as much glue buildup as there is when I use epoxy. But I did use Type Bond 3 glue on these. But I need to clean the edges and get everything nice, flat, and straight. So I'll run these through my joiner planer to do that. But I completed the cleaning up of these laminated boards for these rosettes. And these were first of all cleaned up on my joiner planer. And then I did run these through my disc sander just to finish polishing them. And that's the 4 of them ready to go. Now these are all ready to be cut into segments. For this project with these 4 rosettes, I want my OD to be right around 5 inches. And I plan on putting spaces between each of the wedges of around 35 thousandths of an inch. And I will begin making 48 segments per ring. So as a result, my wedges need to be 285 thousandths inch wide. That's 0.285. So I have it all set up, calibrated for that. So I'll start cutting all these pieces up to make my wedges. And again, that'll be 48 wedges per rosette. And I have my laser beam turned on once again so I can see where I'm going to cut. And then going back and forth between the 2 fences, I have my Accu-Wedge set to 48 seconds per wedge. My stop's been set up. I position my board in the middle of the stop, tighten it, push down and against the fence and against the stop, so it's perfectly positioned each time. And it is important you clamp the board. If you try holding these boards freehand, they're going to move on you because the grain will pull the blade one way or the other and actually force the wood to move. So you must clamp your board at all times. In a likewise manner, I cut the wedges for the 3 remaining laminated boards to make all 4 of the rosette pattern sets. I have my 4 sets of segmented wedges all ready to sand. And I do need to sand the fuzzies off because all these have fuzzies and burrs on the edges, so I need to sand all these pieces. That's a lot of sanding. Just sanding the edges, corners to get rid of the fuzzies. Then I can assemble them in a disc or in a circular shape as I sand. Well, there's the first one sanded. and it shows the marks on the top. And the back looks like this. Now I could make these with no spacers in between, but I am going to be putting spacers in between each of these. But it's another option. You could make a segment ring just like that with no spacers in between them. So there's our 4 patterns ready to make rosettes. And I do plan on putting inserts in here. But you can see you could do this without inserts. Be another way to make some rosettes. But I'm planning on putting some inserts in this. And in fact, I'm going to be putting some multi-layer, probably 3-layer inserts. With some very, very thin inserts. I'll be using my Accu-Slice system to cut a bunch of strips to make the inserts for the guitar rosettes I'm making for this project. And I'm starting off with a board of catalogs. This is a piece of real dark black catalogs. It's about 1.5 inches wide, about 20 inches long. And I'll be cutting a bunch of strips 1/15,000 of an inch thick. Instead, I'm using my Accu-Slice system with my Accu-Sled 2 carriage. This is my 30-inch carriage. And I'm using my flat plate clamps to clamp a low profile board on here. So I'll be cutting boards 1/15,000 of an inch thick. And I'm using a 1/2 inch wide blade, 10 teeth per inch. Okay, I just finished cutting a bunch of strips of boards from that piece of catalogs. And I got 11 strips from that board. And each of these right around 1/15,000 of an inch thick. And the surface is very nice. This was cut with a 10 teeth per inch blade. And the surface is perfect for gluing. Very, very smooth. So the only sanding I need to do is to move the fuzzies at the end where it kicks out the bandsaw blade. I get a little bit of a fuzzy or a burr, and that has to be taken off with a chisel, and that's about the only sanding I need to do. Probably also sand the bottom edge where it goes through to get rid of any fuzzies on the bottom edge. But no surface sanding is required from those boards. I'm ready to glue up some set of spacers for these rosettes I'm making. And this will be 3 layers. 2 layers of the dark catalogs and a middle layer of maple. And again, I'm using Type-On 3 glue. And once again, we use the same procedures to glue up these 3-layer laminate boards that were used to glue up the previous laminated boards. These are my pieces, and these will be my spacers, my 3-layer spacers. So I got a piece of that catalogs in the middle and 2 maple on the outside, so it's a 3-layer piece. And I got my height set, and I have my system set to cut the width. So, and I already cut a couple pieces, so these will mount on each side of my segments like that. And keep cutting them, and you cut a total of 48 of these. Okay, as I've done in the past, I need to glue these spacers to one side of these wedges. And I already did sand the fuzzies off the edge of the wedges, off the spacers, and the wedges also. And again, I'm using Type-On 3 glue. That's how they're being glued up. I continue gluing these spacers to one side of each of the wedges. In a previous video, I used hand sanding on some sandpaper to clean up these spacers to get them flush with the wedges. But I was having a few problems doing that. I was getting some rounding up of corners, and it just wasn't the best way to do it. So I'm now using this miniature disc sander, it's the modeling disc sander, and I'm using that to sand these spacers flush to the wedges. And the result is much, much better. There's no rounded corners, and it came out nice and straight and clean. So that's what I'll be using forward to clean up all my wedges. I sand these spacers so that it's flush on all four sides of the wedges. And then I repeat the process for the remaining wedges. After the pieces have been sanded on the disc sander, I do sand the fuzzies off the edges. And that's the result, nice and cleaned up. Not only is it better, but it's a lot faster than the hand sanding I did before. After all the spacers have been sanded flush to the wedges, I then assemble the wedge assemblies onto my glue-up jig, getting ready to produce the final assembly. I place a rubber band around the assembly and then check for the alignment and the correct diameter of the inner spacer. I use the same procedures to glue up the wedges to make the segmented disc as was shown in the previous video. Applying glue to both sides of the wedges, and I'll be gluing in two sets, each time gluing up one half of the wedges. After half the wedges have been glued, I then place rubber bands around the wedges to clamp them in place, and then check alignment of the wedges, making sure they're tight against the inner ring and also tight against the bottom. And this is what the bottom pattern would then look after they're glued up. Again, double checking the alignment, making sure everything's straight. And let that dry for, an hour, and then I'll glue up the second side. Now I just glued on the final pieces. And this is the completed pattern on the base. In a likewise manner, I glue up the other three rosette discs. Okay, I'm just going to clean these faces up on my edge sander. So there's the two surfaces. This is a tulip wood in the center with maple and catalogs on the outside, and three level spacers in between each of the wedges. Now I'll put this on the lathe and chew up the inside and the outside. Here's the second rosette cleaned up with the zebra wood in the center. And here's the third rosette pattern, again with the tulip wood in the center. Well, there's what the faces look like now. One side and then the other side. I mounted each of these segmented rosette discs into the cold jaws on my chuck, and then used the fine, square-edged carbide tooth blade to chew up the ID and OD of the segmented disc. This not only cleans up the excess glue, but it makes sure the discs are perfectly round. Because the jaws on the cold jaw do interfere with the cutting of the OD, I needed to reverse the segmented disc, turning 180 degrees several times during the cleanup operation. As a final step, I used some 100 grit sandpaper to clean up both the ID and OD of the disc. And this is the resulting cleaned up disc. In a likewise manner, I cleaned up the remaining rosette disc from the other three patterns. Okay, this first rosette disc I'm cutting is the product disc. A little less than about a little more than 3/4 of an inch thick. So we'll see how many pieces we get out of there. We should get at least, I think, 6 out of it. So this first cut is just to give me a flat surface. So I'm just cutting off like maybe a 10,000th inch sliver. And this is the reason we cut off a scrap disc, because I just measured this, and it's not, even on all sides. This thin side's about, maybe 15,000th of an inch thick, and this thick side's probably 35,000, so it's not perfectly straight. But now I have a flat surface, so all the boards coming off now should be perfectly flat, but this is no good. So once again, I'm using my Accu-Slice table with the double magazine clamps. This was an idea that came from Dan Mitchell, and I've been using it now for a few weeks, and it seems to be working pretty well. But you do need the extension rails on your bandsaw, because you need a wider table to clamp these down. So everything's locked, my gauge was 0. So I'm going to cut some boards, probably 65,000 of an inch thick. So my blade kerf is 45,000, so 1 turn, 2 turns, plus another 10,000. That should give me a board around 65,000 of an inch thick. Okay, that ended up being 66,000 of an inch thick, all the way around. And that's the finished surface you get. It's pretty nice. So I need to sand the fuzzies off the edge. That's the only sanding that's needed. So I cut a couple more discs, not the same thickness. I'm trying to make each of these around 65,000 of an inch thick. So I was able to cut 6 rosettes from that disc, each of those 65,000 of an inch thick. Had I made them 50,000 of an inch thick, I could have gotten one more, but I think I like the 65,000 thick a little bit better. This next rosette disc is the disc with the maple and product spacers in between the tulip wood pieces. So let me cut a scrap piece off first, and then we'll cut a bunch of these, again, probably 65,000 of an inch thick. Well, that segment of disc I started off was about 1.25 inches thick, and I was able to get 10 rosettes from that disc, and each of these is 65,000 of an inch thick. And the only sanding I need to do is to sand the fuzzies off the edge. But that's the finished rosette. This next rosette disc is again the tulip wood, but this has the maple and catalog spacers. So the center white piece is maple, but then these center pieces here are the tulip wood. So again, let me cut a piece of scrap off, a thin piece, and then we'll start cutting some disc. Again, 65,000 of an inch thick. I was able to cut 6 discs off that disc. There's another piece of wood left. I can probably cut 6 more, but I'll need that for a future project. Now this disc did open up at one point. There's a small gap. I can either glue that back together, but I'd probably just leave it as it is, so there's no tension on it. This concludes part 3 of this video series on a production of guitar rosettes. In videos 1 and 2 of this series, we described the production of rosettes using a 15-layer laminate board to produce the 48-segment rosette rings with a single layer spacer between each of the wedges. In this video, we described the production of these 48-segment rosette patterns with a center wideband of tulip and zebra woods, which was then accented with 3 layers of contrasting woods on both the inside and outside of this figured center band of wood. Also in these 4 rosette patterns, we incorporated a 3-layer spacer between each of the 48 segments. Each wood layer in these thin separators was between 12 and 15 thousandths of an inch thick. This first rosette pattern has the 48 tulip wood wedges outlined by a band of padauk on the inside and outside of the ring, a 3-layer spacer between each of the wedges consisting of padauk and yellow heart. This next rosette pattern has the 48 tulip wood wedges outlined with some layers of ebony and maple on the inside and outside of the ring. And then the spaces between each of the wedges consist of 3 layers of alternating maple and catalogs. This next rosette pattern is very similar to the previous pattern, again using tulip wood for the wedges, surrounded by maple and ebony on the inside and outside of the ring. The spaces between each of the wedges consist of 3 layers of alternating maple and padauk. This is the 4th rosette pattern made in this video. It consists of zebra wood wedges in the middle, outlined by maple and ebony on the outside. And then the spaces between each of the wedges consist of 3 layers of alternating maple and catalogs. We did make one change to this rosette pattern. We added 2 layers on the inside and outside of this ring after it was done of catalogs and maple. We'll show how we added these inside and outside rings to this segmented disc in part 4 of this video series. We do have a limited quantity of these rosette rings if anybody is interested. They'll be available on our website. Once again, thank you for watching this video. If you have any questions, concerns, or comments, please give us a call or drop us an email. And thank you.